It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Joshua Gubler. When the Kennedy Center decided a couple of years ago that we wanted to have a disciple scholar lecture every semester, Professor Gubler has always been at the top of our list as someone that we think really models that wonderful combination of great scholarship and discipleship. He, as his students will attest, is a really remarkable teacher who teaches with great empathy and compassion for the world. His scholarship also focuses explicitly on questions of empathy, on polarization, on how we might mitigate the conflicts that we face interpersonally and the way in which that might lead to greater peace building around the world. Professor Gubler graduated from Brigham Young University in Near Eastern Studies. He obtained a master's degree from the University of Utah in Middle East Studies and also in political science, and went on to get his PhD at the University of Michigan. He's a political psychologist who has been a visiting research fellow at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at Brown University as well. He's multilingual. He speaks Arabic and Russian and Hebrew and German and English. Lots of languages. I think today will be in English, for which we're all grateful. He's the father of 5 children, 3 of whom are students here at BYU. He loves mountain biking and backpacking and fishing. He's a pretty competent electrician. And just a remarkable asset to the BYU community. The title of his talk today will be Blessed are the Peacemakers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gubler.
Well, it is just wonderful to be here with you all. I see so many faces that I recognize, so many that I don't. I am grateful to Quinn and others for making this type of a lecture possible, and I'm really grateful for the community that we have here, for the community that is created, both at BYU at large, but also here in the Kennedy Center. Right? This is just one of the very best communities you could ever be a part of, and I feel really grateful for that. I'd like to start with the story, right? That begins back in the 1900s, way back, 1998, when I had hair. I just wanted to put this picture up to show you, right, that there was a time when I had somewhat long flowing hair, and I enjoyed it. I think God took it from me specifically for that reason. Right? This is a story that happened in 1998. One evening in 1998, my missionary companion and I crept out of our bedroom in Omsk, Siberia, to deal with the problem once and for all. I had a can of the Russian version of Raid in each hand. Right? My plan was simple. My football player companion would carefully creep into the kitchen in front of me, wrap his arms around the fridge, and then throw it to the side the instant I flipped on the light. We would then kill them all. Every single nasty cockroach that had plagued us for as long as we could remember. You know, my recollection these days is that the plan worked beautifully, right? There was a massacre of nearly biblical proportions, right? I think of 1,000. I mean, in reality, it was probably 100. But that's a lot of cockroaches, right? Some of you can relate to an apartment that looks like that. 1,000 dead in moments is how I think about it, right? Satisfied with our work, we unceremoniously swept up the bodies of the dead, went back to our beds, and fell into a very peaceful sleep. To this day, neither of us feels any regret for the massacre of Omsky Hills. Why? Because cockroaches aren't human. At least I don't think of them as human. A dozen years later, when I had considerably less hair, but still some, I want to show you that as well. This is in 2010. All right. My wife, Wendy, and our 3 oldest children, all of whom were quite young, as you can see at the time, sat in a room in a foreign city celebrating a religious holiday with our lovely neighbor, one of the kindest people we knew. She'd brought holiday cookies for the kids, and as we sat chatting and munching on cookies, I casually mentioned that we'd crossed through a series of checkpoints a few weeks earlier and spent time with friends of the other ethnic group in the region. The conversation paused. She said, "Friends? Them?" She then voiced a sentiment strikingly similar to mine that Siberian night years earlier, but this time directed towards a different them. Kill them all. I still remember our son Ben's eyes. I remember them going wide and him stopping mid-cookie bite. He was the only one old enough to understand what was happening before we rushed him off to bed. I've spent the last 15 years of my life trying to understand the psychology behind this type of sentiment, trying to identify ways to rid ourselves from that type of a sentiment. Certainly, as I'll note later, right, in many cases, these sentiments come from valid, powerful lived experiences, right? Members of a group that killed one of my relatives or oppressed my parents. Scholars of threat and trauma have quite a bit to say on this topic. Here I take up just a piece of this larger issue, right? I focused my efforts on trying to understand how good people, like this friend, and every one of us in one way or another, can feel good about thinking, saying, or doing things that pursue harm towards members of an outgroup, right? Often this stems from our perceptions of the actions of a few members of that outgroup that are then applied to the outgroup as a whole. In academic terms, what I've spent the last 15 years studying, right, is prejudice. Trying to understand the factors that generate it, the factors that make it so incredibly hard to overcome, why it's so sticky, and trying to identify approaches based on that understanding for things we can do to rid ourselves from it. I'd like to share some insights from that journey today. But first, I just, since this is a disciple scholar lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role that my discipleship or my religious commitments has played in generating some of the insights that I'll share a little bit later. I was raised, so to speak, intellectually here at BYU on this book, on becoming a disciple scholar. I believe, as my Univ 101 students and I talked repeatedly about, maybe even too much about, they might have said, as the semester progressed, that disciples, right, have a responsibility to pursue topics like prejudice and other things like that through both study and faith. And what I want to say here before I jump into some of these insights is that it's not just the case that our discipleship should inform just our interest in pursuing certain topics, right? So because I'm a disciple of Christ, I'm interested in pursuing the good society. It shouldn't just be a motivation or a why for us, right? I think it should also motivate the what and the how. I think that scholarship and discipleship walk hand in hand at every moment of a disciple's life. And that's how I feel like my journey has been. Let me give you an example of that, right? So I believe that Like others, I believe that a core component of the call to be a disciple of Christ is to pursue peace, to be a peacemaker, and that hearts imprisoned by prejudice are incapable of the type of love necessary to fulfill this call. But my religious understanding has also dictated the type of peace, the type of peace that I pursue, right? It's not as the world giveth, right? To paraphrase Christ, as quoted in John, right? And it's not just an end to interpersonal violence, although that's a natural outcome of true peace. It's not, sometimes we call that a negative peace in political science. It's not the erasure of conflict, interpersonal and large scale. I actually don't believe that conflict itself is a negative thing. It's often the engine of human growth and progress. Violent conflict, now that's negative, right? But peace and conflict coexist all the time. They have to, right? My understanding of peace, the type that I try to pursue and engender in my own lives and others' lives, is inspired by the gospel. It, like heaven, is as much a state of being as it is a context, right? It's a state in which we as individuals seek to understand, value, and deeply love all of God's children. That's peace, regardless of context. People in this state naturally, to use the words of our inspired prophets, right? Root out racism and all other forms of prejudice. They root them out of their heart. Their love for others transcends what Joseph Smith called the narrow, contracted notions of men, the socially constructed, human-constructed boundaries that we throw up to separate ourselves one from another. People who are able to obtain this peace for themselves naturally become true peacemakers. They create relationships, homes, communities, and societies where love of God and love of others abounds. That's what I'm after here, right? So my gospel focus, my discipleship has naturally led me to study prejudice. It's led me to study peace, and it's defined what it is for me, right? And as you'll see hopefully a little bit further, it is woven into how I think about pursuing the insights that I obtain. So every step of the way. And I believe that part of the role of the Spirit is to help us see things and understand things we would not otherwise see and understand, given the limits of our own personal experience. And that is a tremendous blessing when we're in the pursuit of truth. Both truths with lowercase t's, as we'll talk about in a minute, and truths with uppercase t's. Ultimate, eternal truths. So, let's talk a little bit about some of the insights from this journey for me. And then at the end, I'd love to have some question answer and some discussion about your insights from the journey that you have been on in this space. So first I want to define prejudice. I'm going to define prejudice as reducing a group of people to a set of negative stereotypes based on our perceptions from lived experience with a few. In other words, it's an inability to see groups of people as fully human. It is taking experience or perceived or perceptions about some few members of a group, and it's applying it writ large to another, all the other members of that group. It typically takes the form of negative stereotypes. Stereotypes that sound something like this, right? All, fill in your favorite ethnic out group. All members of group whatever, right, are lazy, or they only understand violence, or they're more unstable and emotional, right? Or they're just morally deficient, right? If my experience in some way leads me to believe that some members of this group with whom I've interacted, potentially, or just read about, or heard about, or my grandma mentioned this over pie, or whatever it might be, right? That's all lived experience. If my lived experience leads me to believe that some few are this way, right, then prejudice is taking that and applying it to an entire group. Prejudice is a problem. It's a problem because it changes what I see and what I feel and how I behave towards others. It sets expectations, right? Generates predictions, as we're going to talk about in a moment, about who other people are, right? And in so doing, changes my behavior towards them, right? In many cases, as Albert Bandura notes, seeing individuals as less than human facilitates moral disengagement. It enables us to put a group of people, a type of people, into a category which, for a number of reasons, provides justification for us to treat them differently, right? To treat them as a little less than human, to deprive them of one of the core things that we humans believe we should grant one another, which is moral agency, the ability to act and pursue meaning in life, right? We only grant that agency to other humans because we think they're thoughtfully capable of acting on it. Certainly a group of people that only understands violence, or is more emotional than rational, or fundamentally wrong or dangerous, would be a liability were they to have this type of agency, right? To give it to such people increases the likelihood that their wild behavior will impinge on my own agency, damaging myself and others. In such cases, then, when I'm able to adopt these stereotypes towards others, it makes a lot of good moral sense to me. That in this case I can use coercion, violence, intimidations, threats towards them to get to the things, the right outcomes, the things that are necessary because they're not going to get there on their own, right? While such behavior is not justified towards fully human humans, it often seems like the only route possible when we have hearts that are bound up by prejudice. So, reducing prejudice between individuals and groups of people who are in conflict doesn't always solve the conflict, and that's an important thing to note. If two individuals want the same land or access to the same water source, right? When we reduce their prejudice in the conflict one towards another so that they truly understand one another, there's still just one piece of land and still just one water source, and that conflict needs to be worked out. What reducing prejudice does, however, is it expands the scope of possibilities that I and the person with whom I'm in conflict with might consider as ways out of the conflict. Right? It expands that set of opportunities. You see, if I had believed that those cockroaches in my apartment were human, we would have approached things very differently, right? We might have set out a bowl of pelmeni in the middle of the kitchen floor and invited them to some sort of a peace conference. Started with this discussion, seems like you and I both think this kitchen is our own, right? And turns out there's only one kitchen, we've got a conflict here. But I want to listen to your concerns and you're going to listen to... That's what you do, right? If you believe people are fully human. You don't do that if you don't. And that's one of the easiest ways, by the way, to tell where our perceptions and where our hearts are towards others. So, now on to some insights from my research as part of the scholarship and discipleship mix part of this journey. Okay? And here, friends who are in the audience are going to say, hey, I co-authored that paper with him, and that will be true. And hopefully I do justice to a broad sweep of some of the things we talked about. So lesson number 1 from my research and from the work of others, and from my lived experience, is that prejudice arises as a natural result of social construction, a term I'll define momentarily. It often emerges naturally as we grow up. It's not that there are a certain set of people who are necessarily more prone to it or more morally deficient naturally, right? This is a natural thing that we all experience, hence the need to root it out. So to discuss how I think this happens, I want to talk a little bit about a theory called social constructionism, right? As scholars, as disciple scholars, we realize that there's no such thing as objective observation, right? And that means that it's really hard to get at truths with a capital T, things as they really are, as talked about in the Doctrine and Covenants, through methods that are based on my biased information and observation and all of those types of things. We, as the Apostle Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. And one of the ways that we try to go about it then, as social scientists, is we identify theories, which are models, shadows, in a sense, of things as they really are, and we use them as long as they're useful. And a lot of theories are useful, right? Based on theories like the Bernoulli effect, right? We can fly planes with confidence, right? Based on economic theories and some theories of governance and a variety of other things, we can create societies that generally are a little better, right? So there's usefulness to these theories. But we're under no illusion, at least we shouldn't be, that these theories represent some ultimate reality. They get us to truths with lowercase t's, not with capital T's. So I want to talk a little bit about the theory of social constructionism and how it relates to the generation of prejudice. This is a theory I find really compelling, as those who know me know. They're kind of tired of hearing about it, right? 5 years from now, it might be a different theory. That'll be okay. So social constructionists, and the most prominent social constructionist alive at present is Lisa Feldman Barrett. Social constructionists begin with the assumption that the fundamental task of the brain is not thinking as traditionally conceived, but it's allostasis. The goal of the brain is to correctly predict body resource needs in the next moment. For example, a little bit extra cortisol if we're going to need to run, or engage with a disliked out-group out-partisan, right? A little extra insulin if we're to eat cake. And some of my favorite experiments, some of my students have heard me talk about this, are experiments that show the consequences of misprediction, right? You give someone a Costco muffin and tell them it's a health food, right? And then you measure their blood sugar after they've eaten it. Their brain mispredicted, their blood sugars crashed. You give them a Costco muffin and you tell them, this is really just a piece of cake, right? They put enough insulin into their blood and their blood sugar doesn't crash. So these predictions matter, right? And the goal is allostasis, to keep things from crashing in the body, right? So to predict the next moment, social constructionists assume that our brains create and store concepts. These are typologies formed from bits of past experience or memories that were relevant to past resource assignment. Last time a thing like this happened, I needed cortisol and didn't have it. This time I'm not going to repeat it, right? That's what the brain is doing. As Daniel Schachter notes, this is the purpose of memory, right? Even though we tend to think, he says, about memory being all about the past, it's really all about helping us prepare for the future. These concepts are manufactured types of things the brain expects to experience, again, objects, types of people, types of ideas, types of contexts, right? And they enable the brain to filter out noise, to focus in on the things that it believes are relevant, speeding up resource allocation time. If I have to consider everything at every moment for every prediction I make that's overwhelming, I'll be slow on the draw, right? So we create these concepts, these heuristics, these shortcuts, right? The result is that once our brains have created a concept like book or apple, right, we see something more than pixels. We see the concepts. They become reality. The important thing to note here is that we do the same thing for ideas and for people, categorizing them into types because it's efficient for prediction. Immigrant, Democrat, Republican, Arab, Israeli in my world, right? White, black, and so forth. So in other words, the process of growing up is a process of learning to see less. And anyone who's had children knows that that's the case. If you ever walked outside with a young child and they are literally seeing things that I literally do not, because they've been deemed irrelevant by my brain over time as I've grown up, right? As the group labels I've just listed suggest, when it comes to seeing others, this often means that at least at first, we naturally see others we don't know, which is virtually everyone, as stereotypes. These type of people are blank, right? So I should run or dance or whatever it might be, right? We naturally see stereotypes. Now, given systemic factors that have differential effects on groups of people, right, to the degree that such stereotypes capture general trends, they can generate efficiency benefits to prediction. They can help us predict and avoid situations, for example, where we might be likely to experience harm. So prediction using socially constructed concepts, our brains do it because it's remarkably empowering in a variety of contexts. However, all concepts erect borders or boundaries between different types of things. That's the goal. Different types, different classifications of things. And as such, limit what we see over time. Remember, the process of growing up is a process of seeing less. Stereotypes limit our ability to find and create peace. Part of the reason God is all loving, I believe, is because He's all understanding. Stereotypes prevent us from that type of understanding. They prevent us from growth in the way that He would have us grow. So the theory of social constructionism undergirds lesson number 1. Prejudice is a natural result of social construction. It has efficiency. It provides efficiency gains to prediction, to sort people into different groups, right, and behave based on that sorting. But it does distance us from God, right? The natural man, the man run by the organism alone, right, is indeed an enemy to God, right? So, what's fascinating is in research that some colleagues and I have done, we have shown repeatedly that this prejudice has really significant effects, unconscious effects on how we treat others. Here's a paper where we show that we ask you your opinion on some sort of a policy, okay, some sort of a policy that you know would harm other members of your society. Okay, that's what we do in this paper. We do it in Israel and we do it in India. a policy that you know would harm the outgroup in your society. And we have a control condition where people just give their attitudes on the policy, and then we have a treatment condition where we simply mention the name of the outgroup, and we provide one word that suggests that there's conflict between them. That priming changes attitudes dramatically, with people becoming significantly more likely to adopt a prejudicial policy towards the outgroup. Just that simple priming. They're unconscious that it's happened. That's what social construction does to us. It shapes our behaviors and our thoughts unconsciously in ways that dictate dictate a lot of the outcomes in which we're interested. Okay, I've got 10 minutes here. Lesson number 2. Credible challenges to these concepts that are literally our world, right? The concepts are what we experience as our reality, right? Credible challenges to them, particularly the more closely they're tied to our sense of self, create dissonance. A feeling of deep discomfort, right? It does this for a variety of reasons, right? If I've reduced others to some sort of a negative stereotype, then when that stereotype is challenged, I get information that they're not actually all violent, or that they're not all morally corrupt, or that whatever it might be, right? It impacts my view of self because I define myself of necessity in relation to others, right? Philosophers talk about this as the dialogical nature of human self-identification. I naturally define myself in relation to others. So if that view changes about others, right, I receive credible evidence that they're not what I thought they were, it impacts my view of self. I'm prone to think, well, if they're not that way, then who am I anyways, right? And what does this mean about my less than ideal treatment of them all along, right? I was fine with that when they were not fully human. But now I'm a whole lot less fine, and we feel discomfort. Okay? So this is a study with Quinn Monson here and a number of other colleagues, where we showed that we ran this what we thought was a fascinating experiment, right? I was going to say we ran this fascinating experiment. You might think it's dull, but we ran an experiment where we showed that if we removed context from people of color, in this case Hispanics, for Utahns, and just humanize them by showing that, here they are doing because a lot of Utahns have some negative stereotypes, unfortunately, right? Here they are sharing your values and doing a variety of things. We showed a video of a family talking about their hopes and dreams in one study. In another, we showed a variety of pictures. We showed that if we did that without context, without providing context on really who these people were, that it worked. People felt like, yeah, these people are wonderfully human, fantastic. But when we provided context and said some of these individuals are undocumented, the empathy that we had created was wiped away by the dissonance. A concept that people held in their heads entirely changed their response to these images and videos, right? And as a result, in some cases, we had backlash. I'm now regretting I should have thrown up some of the open comments that we got. We had backlash, and people in some cases, seemed like they got more aggressive towards the outgroups that they disliked. Dissonance. The third lesson that I'll end on here in the last 7 minutes that I want to take here is that to make peace for ourselves and others requires constructively dealing with this dissonance such that we can grow. Dissonance itself is not a negative thing. It's like an alarm bell. It's a signal that something in our worldview, in our set of concepts, in our perception of ourself, right, isn't quite right. There's something off. I see myself as fundamentally kind and humanist, and dissonance says, hey, but there's something happening here, right? You need to pay attention to this. That's what it does. The thing that decides whether this is whether this turns into a growth opportunity or into something negative, right, is our choice in how we deal with it. In my earlier work, much of my earlier work was animated by this particular figure, although it actually never appeared in any of that work, right? What the figure shows is that as we experience dissonance, we really kind of have two options. No one likes to live with dissonance. We measure it by asking people how bothered or tense or uneasy or other emotions like that. How much do you feel of those emotions at present? No one likes to live with those unless you're clinically depressed. Then you might. I've been clinically depressed in the past, and I thought those emotions were just like the best thing ever for that period, right? Depression is a real and a terrible thing. But most of us don't like to live with it. So we've got two options. We can justify we want to get rid of it. We can justify our initial position and say, no, actually, those guys are less than human. And here's why. And we can go and search up information to confirm that and say, and this idea is really wrong, and here's why. And we can jump into that process. And when we do, the dissonance goes away. Whew! Turns out that I was right all along. No need to reassess that concept. Or we can assess. In a gospel context, we typically call this repentance and this something else. I don't know what we call it. Not repentance. Pride. That's what we call it. I should have thought about that systematically. Because pride really is actually, I'm thinking about, this is Wendy, right? This is my wife, Wendy. She is brilliant and wonderful, right? I think of President Benson, who said, all pride is false pride. What pride is an attempt, right, to justify who we are and where we are as being right and good and valid. And we typically engage in it only when there's some dissonance bells going off inside that says, hey, maybe not, actually. So, the thing that's fascinating about this, and that we've documented in some of our studies, right, is that if I take the justification route, and how am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to shoot the messenger, for example, hopefully not literally. Sometimes that happens in places I study, right? But I'm going to shoot the messenger figuratively, right? I'm going to throw up a set of exceptions. This is moral disengagement. I'm going to do a variety of different things. What happens is when I do that, the dissonance disappears. But what is the process to make it disappear? I've just justified something that was morally reprehensible enough to me in the first place that it set off dissonance bells. I've now just justified it as morally right so that next time it doesn't. What happens then? Well, I live with my prejudice. And it shapes how I behave, it shapes what I say, it shapes what I do, it shapes what I see and feel. And when I do that, I treat people in a certain way. They tend to respond in kind. Most of us do. And I say, oh my goodness, right? See, that's just more evidence that they are that way, right? They really are a jerk, or they really are less than human in this way or that way. I see stereotype confirmation, and we go around and around in circles, right? Myself and this other person, both of us convinced that we have the moral high ground. And that's the conflict here is really just the other person's fault, right? If only they would blank, when in reality we are playing an active role in generating the conflict that we ourselves claim to ourselves we're trying to avoid. That is one way to deal with dissonance, right? That's the result of making this move here. Better ways to deal with dissonance? We reassess. Honestly, we look inside ourselves and say, there was an alarm bell going off. Is it a justified alarm bell? Are there reasons for it, or are there not? Sometimes we come back to the original concept that we had after careful re-examination. Many times that concept becomes nuanced and colored with other understandings of things. Now, my colleagues and I have done this, have looked at this process in a variety of different ways, and I wish that I had more time here. Maybe in question and answer I can talk about it. But the question is, if dissonance is the problem, and non-constructively dealing with it, right? So that's actually the problem. If that's the problem, then how do we overcome it? And we have run a variety of different experiments to try and attempt helping people do that, helping them feel safe, right? Safe enough to reassess, because people under threat typically don't do a lot of reassessing. So that is the end of my presentation for today. 3 lessons on prejudice, its generation, why it's sticky, why it's hard to overcome. If we had more time, we could talk about some of our attempts to overcome it. You probably have better ideas. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have 15 minutes to bring you into the conversation. If you have a 1 o'clock commitment or a class you need to get to, you're welcome to take this opportunity to step out. If you are in the lobby and would like to join us for the Q&A, we have some additional seating in here now, and we invite you to come and participate in our Q&A together. If you do have a question, please just raise your hand. We have students with a microphone. They'll bring it to you. We invite you to stand, introduce yourself briefly, ask your question. We'll go until 1 p.m. Thanks.
Paul.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Josh, for this. And this doesn't seem to be on, but I'll just shout it out to you.
Great.
So the priming effect is pretty chilling, I think, right? That we can be subconsciously primed to prejudice and just not even recognize it.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is there a positive side on this? Is there a subconscious priming towards reassessment when we're faced with dissonance? Are you learning anything about that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. So as I understand your question, can we be socially constructed in ways that make us more or less likely to engage in justification versus not? Is that kind of what you're getting at? And I think there the answer is yes. What I did initially to look at this was look at a variety of just demographics, right? Like gender and a variety of things like that. It will probably come as no terrible surprise to you that men are more likely to justify than women when faced with this, right? But I think a lot of this, psychologists talk about something called schema theory, which is a set of schemes that we use to deal with situations in life. And I think that people who have had modeled for them better schemas, right, tend to do a lot better. We have measures in social psychology on things like need for closure, right, and tolerance for ambiguity. These are measures that that people have worked on over time, right? People who have lower need for closure, higher tolerance for ambiguity, are more likely to reassess rather than justify. And so there are some of those types of things, but frankly, I don't have really good answers on that. But I think that in some ways is the million-dollar question. Right?
James Jeffries, graduate. Can you simplify verbal and nonverbal making of peace so we don't get stuck in academic, diplomatic, political gobbledygook?
Can I simplify it so we're not stuck in, I am stuck in academic gobbledygook, right? That's why I'm here. Can I simplify it? So here's what I would say. Those who have the heart of a peacemaker are those who are able to understand and value and pursue the human dignity of others. And the way that we can know that we're a little off base is that dissonance sign, that feeling of discomfort that hits us, right, when we've wandered from that path. And the short remedy to that is reassessment. Is that non-academic enough? Maybe. Yeah, that's about as good as it gets for me. Right. I've got Alex here.
Hi, I'm Alex. Just wanted to ask, so I've kind of thought of reaction or understanding and building tolerance for people who are different from us in sort of like an exposure theory model, where it's, if I participate in a ritual in a religious tradition that I don't come from, or if I learn the language of somebody that I don't, a culture that I don't understand, and I am exposed, then it will start to increase my tolerance. But it sounds like what you're saying is actually that could just trigger more cognitive dissonance. So how do you train the reaction to cognitive dissonance to one of curiosity instead of violence?
Yeah, I think in many cases it does just spur more cognitive dissonance. I think all of us who've served missions have known that there were missionaries who just, like, really, even by the end of their mission, were like, yeah, and I still just kind of really dislike so many things about these people, right? They'd had plenty of exposure. So how do we train ourselves to respond a little bit better? That is something that I'm working on. I don't have tremendously good answers to that. I think there are two things that come to mind initially. One is providing people with enough space. The reason I talk about social construction is because I want people to know that what they're experiencing is natural. It's not some sort of a moral failing, right, that I'm experiencing dissonance. It doesn't mean that now I'm kind of a worthless person. It just means that I'm a normal person constructed in a particular way, and that's why I experience this. Doesn't mean that I should remain that way. But oftentimes, if I can have things framed in that way for me, then it gives me some confidence and some security in saying, okay, well, not all is lost. I can move forward a little bit. So normalizing this a little bit and providing space for people to move forward, I think, is one way, right? Another way that I think we can train ourselves is simply reminding ourselves of this process. I've often found that when I talk with people about this process and I think about it in my own life, humans have this tremendous ability to be metacognitive. I can sometimes just catch myself there, right? I know what I'm looking for now, right? And so as those feelings jump up, right, I can be a little more attuned to them and say, whoa, okay, right, let me make a conscious decision here about what I'm going to do rather than just kind of roll down the path. So oftentimes just making it conscious, I think, is enough for many of us over time. Yeah.
Hi, Jackson Geary. I'm a Middle East Studies Arabic major. So my question kind of relates to Alex's a little bit, but obviously, like each of us having heard this lecture can maybe start recognizing these sort of behaviors in ourselves and things. But if we are in a room full of people and we're the only ones with this kind of mindset, we're still going to run into a lot of the same, challenges or conflicts. And so I guess maybe you were going to talk about this in some of the things that ways that you've sort of tried to foster a culture of this, but in your own personal experiences and maybe in your personal life or with those that you love or people that you have a lot of respect for, what has your experience been trying to work with them so that you can sort of foster a mutual understanding that this is a good way to view problems moving forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do this really poorly, I think, right? But, I do pray every day. And on days when I'm dealing with potentially hard people, I pray multiple times a day that Heavenly Father will help me see them as God sees them. Give me at least a glimpse. Because if I have that, then I can typically behave a little bit better, right? But one thing, and this is the study I had up here, this is with Ethan, who's in the back, and we have some others, other colleagues who've worked on this with us, Ethan and Lisa and David, who's here, right, and some graduate students. One thing that we did in this particular experiment was I think this experiment highlights the power of one person acting in a way that sends off this message that, hey, I see you. I disagree with you, but I validate your experience. I'm not going to dismiss your experience, right? And what we do in this particular study is we use artificial intelligence. We build a chat platform. We have people come in, gun control supporters and gun control opponents, and we randomly assign a trained artificial intelligence mediator to one side, and the other side doesn't know it. And that artificial intelligence, every few turns jumps in and helps an individual in a heated conversation use communication strategies, rephrase what they were going to say before they can hit send on their message. This thing pops in kind of like your mother on your shoulder, right, and says, hey, you can say the same thing, but you could say it in a way that validates, in a way that shows that you understand it and things like that. What we found when we did that is that the person on the other side tended to respond positively. They tended to mimic back. So given the signal, right, that I'm actually going to engage you, right, and we're going to still disagree, but I'm going to engage you. No one on net, at the end of that study, no one changed their views, right? But what did happen is when this person started sending that signal with the help of the AI, this person responded in kind, and at the end, there was greater what we call democratic reciprocity, or willingness to grant individuals space to share their views. So I think even one person, right, can do this. It can be remarkably painful. But, yeah. Evan.
Oh, thank you. Evan Thacker. I'm in the Department of Public Health here at BYU. Thank you, Josh. I'm interested in the small scale of interpersonal relationships as I work with students, for example, in small group projects, or I look at families where sometimes just one member of a small group will become the outcast of the group. Like 4 students working together on a project and one of them offends the other 3 and those 3 push that student out. Or I can't talk to my sister or my brother anymore because they're too triggering, like that kind of small scale thing. And I'm wondering about the first lesson you expressed, that something wrong happens with certain members of a group, and we then apply our prejudice to everyone in the group. Could that also apply to thinking about the change in a relationship over time? And if I've been offended by someone, I might apply a prejudice to the future version of that person and not allow for healing to occur. Have you done any work about that, and can you talk about it?
I haven't, but I think that is certainly likely the case, right? As I think I mentioned just in one sentence earlier, I think one of the damages of prejudice is that it not only binds us, but it motivates us to bind others, right? You are not that way, and so, right, we're not going to give you opportunities for that, right? We limit human potential, human opportunity for change when we pursue the path of prejudice. And so I think what you've described is very likely. Great. Thank you.
Our time is up. Thank you, everyone, for being here.